Zara Brenham settled into her first-class window seat on United Airlines Flight 2417 to Bali, adjusting her headphones and pulling out the dog-eared copy of The Hate You Give she'd been meaning to finish. At 16, she moved through the world with the graceful self-possession of someone much older, a necessity when you're often the only black face in predominantly white spaces. The Jakarta-bound 787 Dreamliner was boarding its final passengers when a commotion erupted from the front of the cabin. A white woman in her 40s, designer sunglasses perched atop highlighted blonde hair, Hermes scarf draped with calculated carelessness around her neck, was gesturing emphatically at her boarding pass while speaking to a flight attendant. "I always book window seats," the woman insisted, her voice carrying that particular pitch of entitlement that commanded attention. "Check again. There must be some mistake." The flight attendant, a middle-aged Asian woman whose name tag read Margaret, maintained her professional composure. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Keller, but your ticket is for 2C, which is an aisle seat. I can check if another window seat is available, but first class is fully booked today." Bethany Keller's gaze swept the cabin before landing on Zara, her eyes narrowing with sudden focus. Without another word to the flight attendant, she marched directly to Zara's row. "Excuse me," Bethany announced, not as a request, but a command. "You're in my seat." Zara removed her headphones, her expression neutral. "I don't think so. I'm in 2A. "Let me see your boarding pass," Bethany demanded, hand outstretched. Though Zara had no obligation to comply, she calmly retrieved her boarding pass from her backpack and displayed it. "Seat 2A, as I said." Rather than acknowledge her error, Bethany's expression hardened. "There's obviously been a mix-up. I always fly in window seats." Margaret, the flight attendant, had approached, aware of the brewing confrontation. "Mrs. Keller, as I mentioned, your assigned seat is 2C. If you'd prefer a window, we can see about arranging that on your return flight, but today's service is full." Bethany ignored her, focus still fixed on Zara. "Look, I don't think you understand. I need the window seat. I get claustrophobic." "I'm sorry to hear that," Zara replied, evenly. "But this is my assigned seat." Something shifted in Bethany's demeanor, her carefully manicured veneer cracking to reveal something uglier beneath. "How did you even end up in first class anyway? Some kind of diversity program?" The question hung in the air, its implication unmistakable. Several nearby passengers looked up from their pre-flight routines, the atmosphere in the cabin tensing perceptibly. "My ticket was purchased like everyone else's," Zara responded, her voice steady despite the public humiliation being directed at her. Bethany let out a derisive snort. "Right! I'm sure you paid for it yourself with your after-school McDonald's job." "Mrs. Keller," Margaret intervened firmly, "that comment is inappropriate. Please take your assigned seat so we can complete boarding." Rather than complying, Bethany escalated. "Do you know who my husband is? Richard Keller, Assistant Director at Homeland Security. He flies this route monthly and always gets a window seat." The invocation of her husband's government position was clearly meant to intimidate, but Margaret remained unimpressed. "Our seating assignments don't operate on recognition of passengers' spouses, Mrs. Keller. Now I need to ask you to take your assigned seat immediately, or I'll have to involve the captain." By now, several passengers had begun discreetly recording the interaction on their phones. A white businessman across the aisle shook his head in visible disapproval of Bethany's behavior. An older black couple in the row behind exchanged knowing glances, all too familiar with the scene unfolding before them. Bethany's face flushed with indignation. "This is ridiculous. Why should I have to sit in an aisle seat when this... She gestured dismissively at Zara, searching for a word both cutting and deniable. This girl clearly doesn't understand the value of what she's taking up. "What exactly do you mean by that?" challenged the businessman across the aisle, breaking his silence. Bethany replied with exaggerated patience that some people only appreciate things when they've actually earned them. First class is supposed to mean something. It's not just about the wider seats, it's about maintaining certain standards. The racial coding in her statement was about as subtle as a sledgehammer, but provided just enough plausible deniability for Bethany to feign offense, if directly called out. Zara remained remarkably composed, though her knuckles had whitened where she gripped her book. She'd encountered versions of Bethany Keller her entire life, at her private school where parents assumed she was on scholarship, at country clubs where staff mistook her for help, in luxury stores where security followed her, but not her white friends. "I won't be moving," Zara stated simply, turning her attention back to her book in a clear dismissal. Bethany's reaction was immediate and volcanic. "Listen here, you uppity little—" "That's enough," Margaret interjected, stepping physically between them. "Mrs. Keller, you need to take your assigned seat right now, or you will be removed from this flight. This is your final warning." For a moment, it seemed Bethany might actually escalate to the point of removal. Then, with theatrical affront, she swung into the aisle seat, deliberately bumping Zara's shoulder as she did so. "This isn't over," she muttered. "Just wait until Richard hears about this." As boarding completed and pre-flight preparations began, Bethany continued a low-level campaign of intimidation, sighing loudly, adjusting her seat to encroach on Zara's space, making phone calls where she loudly discussed her unfortunate seating situation next to some diversity charity case. Zara tried to focus on her book, but the words blurred as adrenaline and hurt coursed through her system. She'd been taught to handle these situations with dignity, to never let them see you sweat, to be twice as good and half as reactive. But sometimes, the weight of always taking the high road felt crushingly unfair. After Bethany accidentally spilled water on Zara's book during the safety demonstration, Zara quietly retrieved her phone and sent a text. "Dad, I need help. Woman in seat next to me won't stop harassing me because I'm black. Getting worse. Flight hasn't left gate yet." Normally, Zara wouldn't have texted her father for something like this. Xavier Brenham's job as FBI Counterterrorism Division Chief kept him perpetually busy, and Zara had grown up learning to handle difficult situations independently. Their relationship, while loving, had been shaped by his frequent absences and her accelerated self-reliance. But Xavier had surprised her by taking 2 full weeks off for this vacation, their first extended time together since her mother's death 3 years earlier. He'd gone ahead to the gate to take a work call, promising to board just before departure. This trip was meant to be a new beginning for them, a chance to rebuild the closeness that his demanding career had eroded. Zara wasn't expecting an immediate response, which is why she was startled when, 5 minutes later, her father appeared at the front of the first-class cabin, his 6 feet 4 inches frame commanding attention even before he spoke. Xavier Brenham moved with the controlled precision that came from 20 years in federal law enforcement. His bespoke suit and subtle Tom Ford cologne spoke of wealth worn with understated confidence. But it was his eyes, taking in the entire cabin in one sweeping assessment before locking onto his daughter, that radiated unmistakable authority. "Sir, we're about to close the aircraft door," a male flight attendant began, but Xavier simply handed him his boarding pass without breaking stride. As Xavier approached row 2, Bethany was mid-complaint to Margaret about the declining standards of first-class service. Her voice trailed off as she registered the imposing presence stopping beside their row. "Is there a problem here?" Xavier asked, his question directed at Zara, but his gaze fixed on Bethany. "Nothing I can't handle," Zara replied, but the relief in her eyes told a different story. Bethany straightened in her seat, switching seamlessly to what Zara mentally categorized as Karen mode charm offensive. "No problem at all," Bethany said with a manufactured smile. "Just a little misunderstanding about seating assignments. You are missing passenger. I believe your seat is further back." Xavier's expression remained impassive. "Actually, I'm in 2B middle seat. Looks like we'll be neighbors for the next 18 hours, Mrs. Keller." she supplied, extending her hand. Bethany Keller. My husband is... Richard Keller, Xavier completed, ignoring her outstretched hand. Assistant Director for Border Operations at DHS. Yes, I know exactly who your husband is. Something in Xavier's tone caused Bethany's smile to falter. You work with Richard? Richard works for me, Xavier corrected, retrieving his FBI credentials from his inner pocket and briefly displaying them. Division Chief Brenham, and I believe you've already met my daughter, Zara. The color drained from Bethany's face as the implications cascaded through her consciousness. She had spent the last 20 minutes racially harassing the daughter of a high-ranking federal official who outranked her husband. Worse, judging by the phones still discreetly recording around the cabin, her behavior had been documented. I had no idea, Bethany stammered. There was a seating misunderstanding, that's all. I might have been a bit stressed about the flight, but I certainly didn't mean... What exactly didn't you mean, Mrs. Keller? Xavier asked, his voice dangerously quiet. When you implied my daughter didn't belong in first class. When you suggested she was here on some diversity program. When you deliberately spilled water on her book. Which part was the misunderstanding? Bethany glanced desperately around the cabin, finding no allies. Even Margaret, professional to the core, was making no move to rescue her from this situation of her own creation. I think there's been a terrible misinterpretation, Bethany attempted, her voice rising with panic. I would never... I'm not... My best friend is actually black, so... Stop talking, Xavier advised, not unkindly, but with absolute authority. You've said more than enough. He turned to Margaret, who had been watching the exchange with carefully concealed satisfaction. I understand we're about to depart, but I'd like to request a seating change. I don't believe my daughter should have to endure 18 hours seated next to someone who has demonstrated such clear hostility toward her. Margaret nodded. I think we can accommodate that request, Mr. Brenham. Mrs. Keller, please gather your belongings. We'll be relocating you. This is outrageous, Bethany protested, though with considerably less conviction than before. You can't just move me because of who her father is. That's preferential treatment. No, Mrs. Keller, Margaret corrected. We're moving you because of your disruptive and discriminatory behavior toward another passenger, which violates our airline's code of conduct. The fact that you unknowingly directed this behavior toward the daughter of a federal official is simply an unfortunate coincidence for you. As Bethany reluctantly gathered her carry-on items, Xavier addressed her one final time, his voice low enough that only those in immediate proximity could hear. My daughter was taught to handle these situations with grace because that's the burden placed on black people in America, to absorb abuse with dignity rather than respond in kind. But she's 16 years old, Mrs. Keller, 16. Think about that when you're explaining to Richard why his security clearance is being reviewed. Bethany was escorted to economy class, where she was assigned a middle seat between two large men who had already claimed both armrests. Her vacated first-class seat was given to an elderly black woman who had been flying standby, hoping to reach her granddaughter's wedding in Jakarta. As the plane finally pushed back from the gate, Zara turned to her father. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Xavier replied simply. You shouldn't have to fight these battles alone, Zara, not when I'm right here. I'm used to it, she said, with a shrug that tried but failed to convey nonchalance. People like her are everywhere. Xavier's expression softened. That doesn't make it right. And it doesn't mean you have to face it without backup. He hesitated, then added, I know I haven't always been there when you needed me. This job... It's important, Zara finished for him, the familiar refrain of their relationship. I know, Dad. I get it. No more important than you, Xavier corrected firmly. I'm trying to do better. This trip is just the start. As the plane climbed through cloud cover, father and daughter settled into a companionable silence that felt like the beginning of something new. Zara resumed reading her book, now dried, but slightly water-damaged. Xavier reviewed briefing documents, occasionally glancing at his daughter with a mixture of pride and regret for all the moments he'd missed. 18 hours later, they arrived in Bali, where a private villa overlooking the Indian Ocean awaited them. A luxury that Zara had grown up with but never flaunted, aware of how quickly people's perceptions of her shifted when they discovered her family's wealth. Over the next 2 weeks, they rebuilt the connection that had frayed during years of Xavier's work first priorities. They scuba dived along coral reefs, hiked to hidden waterfalls, and learned to prepare traditional Balinese dishes from the villa's chef. In the evenings, Xavier finally opened up about Zara's mother. Stories he'd kept locked away since her death, memories too painful to revisit until now. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Bethany Keller returned to a significantly altered reality. The videos of her behavior had circulated within government circles, an embarrassment her husband couldn't make disappear. Richard Keller was placed on administrative leave pending an ethics review, his career trajectory permanently derailed. The incident became a case study in the FBI's diversity training program: how privilege operates, how racial coding functions, how silence from bystanders enables discrimination. Xavier made sure of that, turning a painful experience into an institutional learning opportunity. On their last night in Bali, watching the sunset from their infinity pool, Zara finally asked the question that had been lingering since the flight. Would you have done anything if she had been harassing someone else's daughter? Some random black girl without connections? Xavier considered the question carefully. I'd like to think so, but the honest answer is, I might not have noticed. We get so caught up in our own worlds, our own priorities. It's too easy to look away from injustice when it doesn't directly affect us. Zara nodded, appreciating his candor. That's why it doesn't stop, because most people look away. Then we don't look away, Xavier replied simply. Not anymore. Not from anyone's daughter. As their plane lifted off from Denpasar International Airport 2 days later, Zara noticed their first-class cabin had a different atmosphere than the outbound flight. More diverse, less uptight, the flight attendants treating every passenger with equal attentiveness regardless of appearance or assumed status. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was the different airline. Or maybe, Zara thought as she settled into her window seat, it was a small ripple from the stone they'd cast into the water 2 weeks earlier. A tiny shift in how one corner of the world operated. Either way, she knew she wouldn't face whatever came next alone. And for now, that was enough.